Good morning and welcome to the 17th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We have apologies from Marie McNair. Our first item of business is a decision on whether to take item 5 in private. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Our next item of business is an oral evidence session on the measures the Scottish Government is taking to eradicate child poverty. I welcome to the meeting Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Julie Humphreys, Director Tackling Child Poverty and Social Justice, and Anne Mackenzie, Tackling Child Poverty Policy Unit Head, Scottish Government. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm going to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some brief opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Good morning. I'm grateful for the committee's continued focus on child poverty and for the opportunity to give evidence today. As stakeholders have relayed to the committee, Scottish Government action is having a real impact for families on low incomes across Scotland. In the life of this Parliament, we have delivered considerable action to drive progress on our national mission, in spite of the challenging fiscal environment we have faced. This includes expanding funded childcare, more than doubling the value of our Scottish Child Payment, and supporting thousands of parents through devolved employability services. Our action is making a real difference to families. On average, households with children in the poorest 10% of households are estimated to be £2,600 a year better off in 2025-26 as a result of Scottish Government policies. And we have committed to going further with our programme for government outlining our plan for delivery in the next year, including through investment in breakfast clubs, affordable homes and to develop the systems to mitigate the two-child limit. As members know, statistics covering the year of the interim targets were published in March. It is deeply disappointing that the interim targets have not been met. However, the statistics show that despite strong headwinds, including the COVID pandemic, the cost of living crisis and impacts of continuing UK Government austerity, we have delivered progress, but of course there is much more to do. The proportion of children living in relative poverty reduced in the latest year, and the 2023-24 rate is now lower than it has been since 2014-15, while the proportion in absolute poverty has also fallen, with the annual figure the lowest in 30 years. Rates of both relative and absolute child poverty were also 9 percentage points lower than the UK average in 23-24. 22% and 17% in Scotland, 31% and 26% in the UK. And while the Joseph Rowntree Foundation predicted child poverty will rise in other parts of the UK by 2029, they highlight that policies such as our Scottish Child Payment and our commitment to mitigate the two-child limit are behind Scotland bucking the trend. The Scottish Government will publish our annual progress report on child poverty by the end of June. This will include a full update on the implementation of actions across the past year and further analysis in respect of the interim targets. We are clear that decisions taken by the UK Government are holding us back. It is welcome that the UK Government have now made tackling child poverty a priority for the first time in many years. However, their actions to date do not reflect that prioritisation. The decision not to abolish the two-child cap has meant that around 35,000 children are believed to have been pushed into poverty since the UK Government took office last year, according to End Child Poverty Coalition analysis. And changes to disability benefits announced at the Spring Statement are estimated by the DWP to drive an additional 250,000 people across the UK, including 50,000 children, into poverty by 2029-30. Through cuts and inaction, the UK Government continue to threaten the progress made here in Scotland, and I have urged UK ministers to deliver the change needed through their forthcoming but concerningly delayed child poverty strategy. Irrespective of what the UK Government choose to do, we remain unequivocally supportive of our commitment to meet the 2030 targets. The next Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan is due to be published in March 2026, shortly before the Scottish election. This is materially different to the circumstances under which both of the Scottish Government's previous plans were published, but it also presents an opportunity to build, I hope, consensus across the Parliament and more broadly across Scotland. Development of the next delivery plan has already begun, with an external reference group established to guide our approach and our call for evidence issuing in February. I also wrote to all parliamentary committees to seek views, and I look forward to receiving your considered advice, Convener. Convener, one further upcoming issue to highlight is that, as set out in the annual progress report for 2022-23, the Scottish Government is aware that a technical amendment will be needed ahead of June 2031 to enable the final reporting requirements within the Child Poverty Scotland Act 2017 to be met in full. This is due to the lag in survey data on which targets are based that will not be available until March 2032. Now, I must be clear, this is a minor technical fix and the amendments needed will not require changes to the targets themselves. But if we return to form the next Scottish Government after the 2026 Scottish Parliament elections, it is our intent to bring forward primary legislation to address the technical issue regarding the timing of reporting. Convener, the action we have taken has made a difference to families, and we are committed to building upon these firm foundations. We want to engage meaningfully and widely with stakeholders and partners to build consensus around key areas of action for the next plan, and I look forward to engaging with members as we work to meet the 2030 targets unanimously agreed by this Parliament.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's been very helpful. I'm now going to invite members in for questions. So, first one up is Bob Doris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I say that I'm going to have to leave this session early, so my apologies to the committee and to the Cabinet Secretary, but I'm going to have to do that. So thank you for allowing me to have the opening questions. Cabinet Secretary, a lot of positives in your statement, but I sense a lot of frustrations as well, because you'd wish that the Scottish Government could go further, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in a second. But in terms of the evidence base for what is working in Scotland, I note that child poverty rates after housing costs in Scotland for 2023 was estimated at 22%, in England it was 32%. So something's working in Scotland. Have you disaggregated, Cabinet Secretary, to what extent that's been the Scottish Child Payment, to what extent that's been Best Start grants, to what extent that's been childcare provision, and a variety of measures? So if the committee wanted to scrutinise what different policy levers was having a positive impact, how could the Scottish Government provide information in relation to that?
Well, it is very important that we do look at the evidence to demonstrate impact. That's why the modelling published in March estimates that Scottish Government policies will keep 70,000 children out of relative poverty in 25-26, with poverty rates 7 percentage points lower than they otherwise would have been. You mentioned in particular the Scottish Child Payment, and the estimates are that the Scottish Child Payment alone will keep 40,000 children out of relative poverty this year. It is very important that we do consider the difference that can make to families. Now, clearly, as we move into some of the smaller policies, it is more challenging to demonstrate the impact, particularly on child poverty rates. But we can look at the impact that these can have on, for example, how much it saves for a family. So we have estimates about how much families can save because of free school meals and because of our other policies, which we in total would call the social contract, or our cost of living guarantee for people. So we look at how much they can save through early learning and childcare being available. So as well as looking at the evidence of how many children can be kept out of poverty, we also look at the money that families can save through particular policies. And we'd be happy to provide more of that in writing, should that be useful to the committee.
I think it would be, Cabinet Secretary. So I appreciate that if you like, the so-called less well-kent policies and smaller policies, but targeted, are more challenging to measure the impact that they have. But I think that would be welcome, because I could suggest lots of different ways we could spend more money, Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure you would say, where's that money coming from, Mr Doris? So it's really important that we know what works, what's targeted, and what can make a real difference. Any more information you can provide would be really helpful. Can I ask me one other question in relation to this? Do we survey parents for what works, if you like, in a qualitative sense? So the school clothing grant, free school meals, Best Start grant, it might not turn the dial on child poverty, but it might change the lived experience of families. And we heard some of that evidence convener, when we did our child poverty inquiry. But a lot of people who were not lifted out of poverty still had direct positive life experiences because of targeted interventions by the Scottish Government.
Yeah, I would point to two aspects that may assist the committee building on both your questions, Mr Doris. There's also obviously the cumulative impact assessments which the government will develop. That includes wider ranges of policies, so that the policy package modelled in the cumulative impact assessments do include free school meals, school clothing grant, which is one of the ones that you've mentioned, Best Start grant, Best Start foods, and so on. There's also the other work that is done by Social Security Scotland in terms of its client surveys, which also gets feedback directly from clients themselves, and we can again provide a committee with the links and directions to those reports, because I'm thinking particularly of some of the most recent evidence on the 5 family payments, which has demonstrated the exact type of thing that you mentioned there. Out with government, I think an important part of work that goes on, as well as within the Poverty and Inequality Commission, where they have lived experience panels, which again speaks to that direct experience of those the impacts that can be made. So it's important that we look at the wide-scale modelling, the cumulative impact assessments, but also exceptionally important that we do look at the impact that makes for families. That allows us to have that direct knowledge about different families, different parts of the country, different family makeups, and the impact that can have, which is also very important. So the work of PIC, I think, does very help, as indeed do other organisations. I remember very recently sitting with a panel of parents. I think it was organised by Save the Children, from memory, in Dundee, which was remarkably informative for me, both in terms of what Save the Children spoke to me about, but also indeed hearing directly from the families themselves.
Full Cabinet Secretary, now, of course, the Committee will continue to scrutinise the Scottish Government to push to go further and faster on child poverty levels, despite the fact that compared to the rest of the UK, we're doing, relatively speaking, very well. But that does beg the question about what factors are within the Scottish Government's control to turn the dial on child poverty and what are not. So can I ask whether you think to what extent the trends in child poverty are in the direct control of the Scottish Government, and where that shared space of social security may below targets off course?
Well, there is a challenge that we have in terms of some of the levers are not under the direct control of the Scottish Government. Before I turn to those, I would reflect on just the wider economic context that impacts on everyone, which again makes our policies have to work that little bit harder. I mentioned some of them briefly in my opening remarks, but if we look, for example, at Brexit alone, modelling by the National Institute for Economic and Social Research estimated a 2.5% hit to GDP due to Brexit in 2023, which increases to 5.7% by 2035. In Scotland, this equates to a cut in public revenues across national, devolved and local governments of around £2.3 billion in 2023. So there's one example. There are many more that I could give on the impact that Brexit is having across the society, as I'm sure the member will already be well aware. We clearly also have the ongoing cost of living crisis, where inflation has disproportionately hit some of the most vulnerable in our society. One of the major challenges that you alluded to there, Mr Doris, which you are quite right to do so, though, is the impacts where levers that could be used to assist in tackling child poverty are not being used. The most concerning, but not the only one of those, is the one that I mentioned in my opening remarks about the cuts to disability benefits, which the UK Government's own impact assessments will say that it's estimated 50,000 children will be put into poverty, and we clearly still have no movement on the eradication of the two-child cap. Those two policies alone, one which the UK Government are still refusing to get rid of and one which they are determined to bring in, will undoubtedly impact on the number of children in poverty, and something which the Scottish Government is determined to mitigate against.
Briefly, in that case, so that this committee is trying to have a positive relationship with the UK Government in relation to influencing its child poverty strategy. We'll see how that goes. Cabinet Secretary, do you have any ongoing dialogue in relation to that as a Scottish Government?
We have had dialogue. Well, actually, dialogue would suggest a two-way conversation. We have had a number of meetings. I would be fair to say they have been exceptionally disappointing. We have had not as many meetings as we would like, and not as many meetings that actually allowed for a genuine conversation and an exchange of views. And that has been deeply disappointing. I did hope, given the UK Government's prioritisation to child poverty, that we would have a different type of relationship, and we clearly had the reassurances between the First Minister and the Prime Minister that we would be working in different ways. It would be fair to say that the Child Poverty Task Force from the UK Government has not been an example of a new and flourishing relationship on those issues. And I remain disappointed at the level of contact and the depth of contact that Scottish ministers have been able to have. Nonetheless, at official level, we are ensuring that the task force is furnished with all the available information on Scottish Government policies. But I do stress the importance of the UK Government task force working with all devolved administrations because of the impacts on one policy against another. So, for example, how important it is that devolved and reserved employability schemes work well together, but how we have a shared understanding about the types of policies that we may bring in, the types of policies that UK Government may wish to change, and the impact on what that will have in Scotland. I am concerned deeply about the delay, because the longer these things go on, the more children remain in poverty. But I'm also concerned about the fact that we are not in a position that I have reassurance at this moment in time about the direction of travel of that task force report. Now, I dearly hope that I am proved wrong, and this is a robust report that comes out of that, but it is difficult to say at this point, given the level of interaction that there's been, particularly at ministerial level.
Finally, because our colleagues want to come in, I think one of the biggest challenges for the Scottish Government has been turning the dial in relation to children and families living in persistent poverty. We've got a new action plan, delivery plan being prepared. Will that be a particular focus for the Scottish Government?
Well, it is a concern when we look at the levels of children that remain in persistent poverty, and we are conscious that the statistics that we have at the moment don't yet capture the full rollout and the impact of measures, including the Scottish Child Payment or the expansion to funded early learning and childcare. So we would expect the levels to fall in future years. The fact that persistent poverty data is also refreshed annually with rates in past years' reviews as News Family enters the survey does make this quite a volatile measure, but we are, as I'm sure the committee would expect, continuing to consider what steps can be taken to tackle that deep and persistent poverty for families. One of the areas which I could point to around that is around the whole family holistic support work which is going on right across government to ensure that the services that are available are there for people when they need them, where they need them, and actually work in a way that supports the whole family rather than looking at every single particular challenge or impact on a family, but how we are assisting that family in a much more holistic manner. Those types of policies that look at systemic change are some of the important policies that will assist, I hope, in driving down persistent poverty statistics as well.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite Paul O'Kane. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to Cabinet Secretary and officials. Just looking across the piece in terms of numbers, in terms of child poverty, when your party came to power, child poverty, relative child poverty was at 23% after housing costs. And last year, as we've heard, that was 22%, which is a 1% fall in 18 years. And in the government's own summary, it says, and I quote, "In recent years, both relative and absolute child poverty has shown little consistent change." Would you not accept that that's perhaps just a polite way of saying that you haven't moved the dial in those 18 years?
Well, what I would say is that that is a sign of the fact that Scottish Government policies are having to work a lot harder to make an impact, given both the socio and economic context that we are in, and also because of continued austerity, and particularly the welfare policies of successive UK governments. But the findings are in line with Scottish Government expectations, because a lot of the impacts of our key policies, such as the Scottish Child Payment, have only taken effect from 23-24 onwards. So on that basis, we wouldn't expect to see a substantive reduction in long-term trends at this stage, but we'd anticipate that those will be more evident in future years. As the published statistics have shown, although we've not met the interim child poverty targets, the proportion of children living in relative poverty has reduced last year, and the 23-24 rate is now lower than it has been since 2014-15. So I think what this does demonstrate is that one of Scotland's governments is working exceptionally hard against strong headwinds to eradicate child poverty, but our policies are having to work harder given the context that we're in.
So the government obviously has 6 priority groups in terms of the action it's taken on poverty, and you'll obviously recognise those. But are you concerned that bar one of those, all of those particular groups, we're seeing child poverty up, and in particular ethnic minorities have gone up in 4% in the decade, lone parents up by 5%, and babies under 1 up by 8%. And if we can look perhaps at lone parents, for example, because the Scottish Government does have very extensive powers over supporting people, and particularly lone parents and women into work, do you recognise that there perhaps has been a failure in that space?
Well, I think the aspects around the 6 priority families are very important. If I can point to 2 areas of concern, particularly for me, is around disabled families, given the impact of changes that the UK Government plan to bring into.
Cover that, that'd be really helpful.
And I will. To get into the issue around disabled parents and also larger families, which do impact also on a number of ethnic minority families. And the point I'm trying to make here is the intersectionality of actually a family is often more than one priority family. So while it's important that we look at the policies which will impact on each priority family, I'm also very conscious that a number of families fit into different priority groups at the same time. So as we look at what can help a lone parent, we do need to look at the impact that we make around childcare policies. We do need to look at the impact that we can assist around supporting them if they are disabled. We do need to look at the impact that we can have around employability. One of the aspects for employability is the schemes that are being undertaken to assist parents with employability and moving them into employability. That's an important part of the work that can be done, particularly with lone parents. But I think, and I go back to the point, which is why I'm stressing the 6 priority groups, the work that we are doing on whole family holistic support is exceptionally important. Thoughtful of the number of lone parents that I met on a recent visit, who it wasn't just parental employability support that they were requiring, it was assistance in a number of different matters, both for themselves and support for their children. And if we take that more holistic approach to dealing with the challenges that are facing an individual, then that's also a very important way that we would look at it. But you mentioned particularly around employability support for lone parents, and that's exactly why there's further support that's coming forward this year for parental employability support.
And I wonder, just given what you said there about whole family wellbeing investment and the Scottish Government's investment in employability services, would you expect that poverty rate in terms of lone parent families to decrease over the period in terms of trying to meet those targets?
Well, we are absolutely determined to drive down the poverty rates for the priority groups, and indeed for all the statistics that we have within our child poverty delivery plans. We will absolutely endeavour to ensure that we are doing everything we can to support the 6 priority family groups. But there is a challenge, and I have to come back to that challenge. If there are other policies happening elsewhere that are pushing some of those priority groups into poverty, it does make that more challenging. But I do recognise the importance of employability schemes in that, but that's exactly why the parental employability support is there to provide that wraparound support for lone parents in that area.
And just finally, if I can, in this section, because I know colleagues are going to come on to talk about data, and we've already spoken about the child payment, and I think we're all agreed in terms of the importance of the child payment and also some of the anecdotal evidence that's been raised. But just in terms of the modelling the government's used or is using, you know, a year ago we had many of your colleagues, and I think yourself, Cabinet Secretary, speaking about 100,000 children being lifted out of poverty. Now, that was shown not to be the case, and I think the Statistics Authority had written to the government in that regard. That was then corrected to 60,000 children being kept out of poverty, and we're now at a figure of 40,000 children being kept out of poverty. So I wonder if you can just clarify, is the 40,000 figure the accurate figure in the government's view, and how certain are you, I suppose, of the modelling you're now using to establish it? Because I think everyone around the table wants to make sure we're dealing with accuracy, because it's such an important policy.
Well, with all of these points, I would stress that this is modelling. So clearly, it's modelling using the best information that we have at the time. And the government's been clear this is about keeping children out of poverty. So it's modelling on how to keep children out of poverty. The 40,000 figure is for the Scottish Child Payment. The 70,000 figure is to do with the estimates for overall Scottish Government policies, and that relates back to a question that Mr Doris raised earlier on about estimating the differences that different policies will make. The updated modelling reflects a number of new forecasts that could be put into that modelling based on OBR forecasts, UK and Scottish Government policy announcements that were available prior to the Chancellor's spring statement. And in addition, the latest modelling published in March also incorporated the Family Resources Survey data covering 22-23 and refined the methodology in relation to free school meals. All of those lead to revisions in the estimates. So when new information comes, either from the OBR or when new information comes because of changes within fiscal events at UK level, or indeed when new data arrives through the Family Resources Survey data, which I understand the committee has spoken about the importance of that in the past, then clearly when you input that into the modelling will change, but the modelling itself is robust.
Thank you very much. Before I bring in Liz Smith, I'm going to invite Gordon MacDonald in for a brief supplementary. Thanks.
We've talked about the stats and how they're slightly different, but of course no one policy stands alone on its own. So I'm keen to understand what influences has the Scottish Government got over the two-child limit, the benefit cap, the £20 cut to universal credit, the food inflation, energy inflation, chronic low wages or insecure work? Can you tell me what policies that the Scottish Government can introduce to tackle these areas of social security, cost of living and employment?
Well, there's a number of areas there which the UK Government has responsibility for, but if they choose not to act on those, then the Scottish Government can mitigate. So we're obviously already mitigating against the bedroom tax and the benefit cap, and we will now move to mitigate the two-child cap as well. Some of the other areas clearly are reserved or to do with the economic context, which, no, the Scottish Government does not have any control for. What we do try to do is carry on with work which can assist the UK Government. So, for example, there's been a great deal of work carried on with undertaken by Dr Allen, for example, around the social tariff. All of that work has been fed to the UK Government, so we hope that the UK Government will take that on. So even when there's not something which we have a direct control over, we are doing the best we can to do the research, do the work to assist the UK Government, and I do hope that they take that work up, for example, in the social tariff.
Okay, thank you.
Only now invite Liz Smith in. Thank you.
Thank you. And, good morning. A technical question, if I may, Cabinet Secretary, at the start. In the Scottish Government's publication of March this year, it referred to 2 improvements in modelling, and that was in paragraph 5.1, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. And the Scottish Government has improved that modelling, firstly on the analysis that would go with any potential mitigation of the two-child cap. But the second improvement is down to free school meals. And it says here that the reason for the change to that modelling is because the Scottish Government has changed from taking the whole take-up into a part take-up measurement. And that's because, obviously, the free school meals are not being taken up to the full complement. And therefore, that modelling is better. That's my understanding of the Scottish Government's modelling comment here. Can I just ask about this free school meals situation? Because, you know, we've still got an awful lot of people or families who are not taking up their entitlement. Yep. And things have improved a little bit, but they're not that great. And I just wondered if you have comment, Cabinet Secretary, on whether does the modelling show that those who are not taking up the free school meal entitlement are those from higher income backgrounds?
That level of information, I'm afraid, I don't have in front of me today. I would be happy to provide that in writing.
You know, I'm sure when we get the Scottish Fiscal Commission's report this afternoon, we are going to be in very difficult fiscal circumstances again. And if there are choices to be made about which policies are working, and if it's the case that the free school meal take-up is not as strong as it could be, and people not wanting to take it, then perhaps that is an area where the government could be more targeting. Would you agree with that?
So with all of these areas, there is a policy consideration about whether to have a universal or a targeted support, and that's been something which has been discussed in the past, particularly around school meals. Again, we'll go back to the points about why universalism is an important policy area for certain aspects, such as free school meals. And that speaks to the stigma that's also often spoken about by children and by their families about not being the free school meals kid and not being seen to be separate or different to other children. So while it is exceptionally important, very, very important to take into account the cost of a policy and the fact that it may benefit people who could otherwise afford it, it's also important to bear the evidence and the lived experience of children who talk about the fact that for everyone to be treated the same and for there not to be a stigma is also another important consideration. So you're absolutely right, it is one of those areas where people have had differing views on that, but the universalism for free school meals is based around attempting to help with that stigma that children often feel to.
I'm making the point because I'm quite sure that the Scottish Government, and yourself included, when it comes to social security, are going to be under huge pressure financially to make choices, very difficult choices. And if it's the case that there is a policy where universalism is proven not to get the uptake that you would like, that potentially, I would have thought, is an area for a slightly more targeted approach. And I was at a meeting with the NFUS in Perthshire 2 weeks ago, and they were reporting that in 2 of the local council authorities in my area, the actual amount of food that is being sent back at the end of a school day was pretty grim. And again, that suggests that the school meals are either not of the sufficient quality that youngsters are wanting to take, or other families are still sending them to school with their own lunch. And that suggests, I mean, I understand what you're saying about the stigma, although I think that's very much better nowadays with modern technology and things. I think that's solved the problem. You used to have the ticket that you would take along, and that was far worse. I think that problem is diminished because of new technology. But as I say, when it comes to the choices that are made for universal policies, the evidence is very important about whether that universal policy is actually hitting in all the right places or whether it's not. And you know, we've had in the evidence that we've taken, we've got people asking for an increase in the child payment, at least a doubling of it. We've got people asking for extension of free school meals. We've got increase in the value of the school clothing grant that's being asked for, increase in funding of affordable housing, expanding free childcare. The list goes on, and it would be very nice to do all these things, but we can't.
Yep.
And I'm sure the Scottish Fiscal Commission will come out with that this afternoon. So I'm just asking about whether the government is doing any analysis of the effectiveness of universal policy.
So as I said, I'd be happy to provide further information in writing about the nuance policy and the modelling, the aspects around what the NFUS were discussing there about wastage is concerning for a number of reasons, cost, environmental reasons for food waste and so on. There is a clear need for us to look at how many children are taking it up, and also to bear in mind that you can have a universal policy, but what we also need to bear in mind is for the universal policies, if you're not taking up that policy, you are in essence not costing any money unless we're then wasting the food. So I think there is an aspect about who's taking it up,
correct,
how we pay for that, both Scottish Government, local authority level, and how those estimates are achieved.
Because I think the corollary of this is that if there is a large cohort of youngsters whose parents are a bit better off and who are not particularly wanting the free school meals in the way that we might expect, then they're not part, I wouldn't have thought, of the Scottish Government's target on child poverty. What we do want to see is that the uptake is in the right place and that we're benefiting those who are most in need. And I think the Scottish Government would, in my opinion, be well advised to have a look at that, because I think it's important to the very difficult choices that you as Cabinet Secretary are going to have to make.
Well, indeed, and there is a challenge to ensure that the meals are as nutritious but appealing, so people and children do want to take them up. There's also, I think, a difference about the take-up, for example, at primary versus secondary school and so on. But that issue of looking at who takes the free school meal offer up, and if they don't, why not, is an important area. So I'd be happy certainly to provide further information, because I think you raise a very important point about the usefulness of a policy in terms of its impact on the child poverty.
Are you having discussions with local authorities about this free school meals? One of the people who was presenting to the NFUS was making, well, in the Perth and Kinrossy area, the comment was being made that one of the problems was that, on a procurement level really, that the meals were being brought in from Dundee and obviously costing more as a result of that, whereas I think a lot of people, farming communities particularly, felt that some of the food in Perth and Kinross would have been better and less cost. And Perth and Kinross Council didn't seem to have a particularly good engagement, allegedly, with the NFUS on this. So it's just whether, as I say, I think it's very important to make the right choices for what is working, what's not working, but also to ensure that the local authorities are bought into this.
Yeah, and there is a number of the aspects within that example that is for the local authority to make decisions about procurement and about the meals. And clearly we have national standards when it comes to the nutritional value of foods, but then it is very much up to local authorities to be able to deliver. And members will be aware that the next expansion for free school meals is for those that receive the Scottish Child Payment in primary 6 and 7. So that's an important area of work that is a more targeted approach as the next step. But we do have that commitment to universalism, particularly in primary schools. But you raise a very important point about the take-up of that offer, which is another area which government needs to be concerned with.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think I think we've had this debate before about just how far we can extend universalism and a whole lot of things because of the financial implications. But I think if the government can be looking about some of the real evidence on where the targets are most effective, I think that would be very beneficial too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And that kind of moves on nicely to the next area I'm going to ask about, which is not just with the standing school meals and free school meals, but in preparation of the next delivery plan, what areas do you think you've learned lessons from? What policies do you think's worked well, maybe not so well, and the approach that you're going to take, in particular identifying priority families, and also policies as well, as you know from the submissions, Cabinet Secretary, such as increasing the Scottish Child Payment as well.
So there's a number of areas which I'll touch on briefly. The focus for the delivery plans are based on robust evidence of what works, but there's also a recognition that there's no action in isolation that will deliver the level of change required. When we've looked at the previous plans and into the future, the focus will remain for the next plan on the 3 drivers of child poverty. So that's income from employment, cost of living and income from social security and benefits in kind. Those have been the 3 stools that previous plans have been based on, and the same will be so of the 3rd delivery plan. My understanding from the Evidence Committee has received, and indeed from the conversations we have with them directly, is that organisations such as the GRF, CPAG and so on, we broadly agree with those being the 3 drivers that should be focused on. The other area which we're very conscious of is the need to look at short, medium and longer term aspects to try and break that cycle of poverty. And we've talked about the 6 priority families before, so they will remain an important part of the work that we are doing. When we're also looking at the next delivery plan, I'm very keen that we take a gendered analysis to that work, recognising the importance of tackling poverty as it impacts on women and therefore impacts on the family. And that's an important piece of work that a number of organisations and indeed the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls and Scottish Women's Aids and others have been keen that we undertake that type of gendered work, and I will give that reassurance again that we will do so. If I can point to some of the areas where it is important to look at that systemic change, which I've mentioned before, around whole family support and also the expansion of Fairer Futures partnerships to again look at how we are learning the lessons from the initial partnerships that we had in place and are now expanding that out. So there are a number of lessons that are learned on particular policies, example I've given on the Fairer Futures partnerships, but there's also areas where we can go with confidence, for example, about the fact that the Scottish Child Payment is making an impact. So that will obviously be an important part of the work that we'll continue to do. It is making a difference. And the addition to that, clearly coming up for the next financial year, which will run into the next delivery plan, is the mitigation of the two-child cap. And I would make clear again that should the UK government change its mind and decide to scrap the two-child cap, the First Minister's already made his commitment that the money that is in the Scottish Government budget for mitigation would then be used on other measures to assist tackling child poverty.
Okay, that's really helpful to know that. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your team. We've talked quite a lot already about gathering evidence and being robust on that. Perhaps just to kind of go into a particular area, match childcare expansion, because obviously in the second delivery plan there was a range of pilots, test and learn approaches taken. I'm just wondering, how much information have you gathered from those, and what will that then do in regard to development for next year's plan?
So we are committed to the full evaluation of the expansion to 1140 hours. That will be published later this year. The interim evaluation report was published in August 24, and that did show promising signs that the expansion is delivering improvement in terms of quality as well as affordability and flexibility. There's clearly the other work that's going on in the school-age childcare programme, which includes the Extra Time programme funded in partnership with the Scottish Football Association, Bright Start Breakfast Clubs and so on. And that work's complemented by the insights from the early adopter communities as well. So it is important that we look at the work that is undertaken in the large-scale expansions that are part of the 1140, but that we also look at the evidence base around, for example, the Extra Time programme and the other work that's going on there. And that evaluation will then allow us to be able to design the further expansion about what works, what families are looking for, is what's being delivered through those types of programmes, actually what families need, what families want, and with the clear knowledge that not all families need the same type of childcare in the same type of way. And that's where, again, I'm very cognisant of some of the visits that I've been on to some of the early adopter communities as well, about how some of the programmes are very different from each other, but they work in that particular community or that work for that particular school. So that learning is being undertaken and the evaluation is being undertaken to ensure that we're developing the right programmes in the right places. And it goes back to a point that Liz Smith was mentioning earlier on about ensuring that we are delivering, yes, what parents need, and we're delivering it in a way that is cost effective for that, rather than a blanket approach which may be providing things that parents don't actually require, or that it's not done in the correct way.
Yeah, just to follow that up, I mean, in a previous report, this committee looked at the whole issue of childcare, both within a rural setting and within a more urban setting. And one of the big issues is the provision, particularly for women, at the start of the day and at weekends. So if you're working as a carer or a nurse that starts at 7:30 in the morning, there is no provision at the moment.
Yeah.
Or if you're working shift work over weekends, there is very little nursery provision. What work is, obviously this goes beyond your remit, it goes into other areas, but in general, what areas is Scottish Government looking at providing that targeted childcare? Because one of the big issues that we've heard is that many people can't go back into employment because the hours they work don't fit with childcare provision.
Yeah, and that aspect around flexibility is exceptionally important. I'll be happy to provide a committee with further detail about the work that's been undertaken on that. I do recognise exactly what you're saying, particularly if you take into account travel to work times. It's not just the what time the childcare is available, but then how long it takes you to then get to your place of work. So that's not just an issue in rural areas, but there's an additional challenge there. I think that's why it's important that the aspects I talked about the early adopter and the different schemes can work in different ways in different areas. So flexibility is key, and also working to ensure that what can be done can assist people at different times. The ability to take on shift work, the ability to take on weekends, which is why as we look at areas around childcare, we can often initially have in our minds a very traditional view of childcare in a setting such as a nursery, but there are a number of different ways that it can be provided, and indeed is being provided, and that flexibility will have to be built into the system. But that's what's coming through some of the work that's happening in the out-of-school childcare provision, which I appreciate is different to the early learning and childcare, but happy to provide further information about the work that's been done on flexibility to help Mr Balfour with that query.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I would welcome that. Just in regard to gathering evidence, we're now coming to the end of the second delivery plan. You're working on the third delivery plan. I mean, almost going back to the point made by Liz Smith, things do change. School meals, how they are paid for, are different, even in the last 10 years compared to. So how are you gathering that evidence? Because what was working 10 years ago might not work now. And obviously, to some extent, you've got to look at a crystal ball and say, where are things going in the next 3 to 5 years? So how are you gathering that evidence, and how robust is it, I suppose, we're looking to find?
Well, it ties into a number of questions that people have raised today around evidence gathering, and I do appreciate the points that Liz Smith was making about times have changed when I was in a separate meal queue to others in my school, and we all had our wee tickets, and that was some of the worst examples of stigmatisation you could get to young people. We're not in that place with digital payment cards and so on, but there is still a knowledge, a way that children interact and speak, where you can still have stigma about free school meals that we still have to take account of. So technology improves, gets better, can tackle some of that. But that's one area. It's an important area that we look at. But I give that as an example of how we have to move forward. The areas, I suppose, how we challenge ourselves on that is in 2 points, as I say, we've mentioned earlier. One is the evaluation work that we take over time to look at policies in the round. And the other important area is speaking directly to families themselves about how the provision of services works for them. Because still too often we have services, regardless of whether they're delivered by a public agency, the UK, the Scottish Government, a local authority, that requires too many hoops to be gone through and too much difficulty and therefore stigma for perhaps asking for help. So we combine the qualitative with the quantitative work, when the evaluation strategies do need to look at that and how that changes over time. Technology does help in some areas, and it can challenge us to deliver services perhaps in a more cost-effective way than we would otherwise have done. And another area where we are also looking to make improvements is around data sharing and the ability for local authorities, Scottish Government, the DWP and so on to be able to share data in a way that assists in the delivery to provide a much more cost-effective service and a much more seamless service for people. So I would add the data sharing as another area where government is very keen and is doing a lot of work across Scottish Government to see how that can impact on different policies for cost effectiveness and the delivery of better services.
I mean, I think just on that data sharing, I think it's probably one of the biggest frustrations, probably all MSPs, but everyone has, that we cannot, for some reason, get beyond this. And I know so it would be interesting to get a bit more information on that. My final question, Cabinet Secretary, is in regard, I suppose there's two areas. When we're looking at evidence of child poverty and money is given to a family, is there any evidence to show how much is it benefiting the children or how much is it benefiting other members of that family? Now, I appreciate there's a very close link, but I just wonder, is there any way of saying, you know, that money is going to that family and how much is benefiting the actual children? And secondly, and again, going back to a previous comment, how much are you now looking at to say what should be universal and what should be more targeted? And is this an opportunity for Scottish Government to almost go through each of the different tools we're using, different benefits we're using to say, you know, we've moved on from Plan 3, we're moving into Plan 3, we might want to do more targeting rather than universal?
So on the data sharing, the final point I would make on that is I asked officials through Social Security Scotland to convene a round table very recently on data sharing, because what I was concerned about was we were having a discussion about why it was so difficult with people rather than, well, there are legal complexities. It is arguably, I think, too legally complex, but that's a UK issue. But in the circumstances that we've got just now, how do we actually get it to work? So we've kind of turned the conversation round. So that round table has taken place, and that is one part of the work that's going on around data sharing, because it is something which I am, as my officials know, quite interested in. On the aspects around what benefits children and parents, I think what I would say on that is you can't really disengage what impacts on a child to what impacts on a parent, which is why I mentioned the discussion earlier around a gendered analysis to the next delivery plan, because when you have women in poverty, you have children in poverty. And I use that as an example of how it is so important about how we reflect on how we are assisting not just women, but when we're looking at families, it's an important part of the work. So I would say you can't disentangle the two, and nor do I think government should get to a point where I second guess or judge a family for decisions that those parents or carers are taking. On the final aspect around universalism and targeted nature, what we've been very clear about is that we have no intention of taking away something from people. So I totally appreciate where we can have a debate as services develop or come in around targeted versus universalism, but there is an important aspect to some of the areas where we have a universal approach, that is what the government has promised, it's what we've delivered. And it is part of the package of, if we ask people to pay a little bit more in their taxes through progressive taxes, there should be an understanding that with that there are services that are available to all that wouldn't be available elsewhere in the UK as we move forward with that progressive taxation. So it is a balance, and that's part of the social contract that the government has, is that some of those areas are universal. I appreciate people will have different views on certain aspects of those. Some people want us to go further with universalism. Some people would suggest a more targeted approach for areas that are in. What I would say is that most stakeholders usually come with the suggestion of adding more people to a service rather than a more targeted approach, and it speaks to the challenging nature of the fiscal environment that we're in, that government is asked to do more, but perhaps the public discourse on that is not about what can be taken away from people. But the Scottish Government's position is that if a service or a provision is available at this time, then we should not take that away from people.
Thank you for the answers. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, thanks very much. I believe Gordon MacDonald would like to come in briefly. Thanks.
Just another point of clarification. In terms of Jeremy Balfour's point about targeted support rather than universal support, has the government done any analysis on what administrative costs would be of having targeted benefits as opposed to universal benefit?
Yeah, it's another important to look at. It will vary. It will vary by example, but the aspect around universalism actually taking away administrative costs is often cited. For example, around free prescriptions. So it is another area where if you want to have a service, you do actually have to look at the cost of delivery of that service, and it's often the case that to keep a service as simple as possible is the most cost-effective way to deliver it. So it will vary, but it's a very important point we'll look at universalism.
Thank you.
I'm now going to invite Liz Smith in. Thanks.
Very opportune, actually, because I've just been looking at the conclusions in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's report, and as expected, the expansion of social security spend is really quite significant. Can I ask again, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of the extremely difficult fiscal circumstances and the fact that the Scottish Government does not have the money available to do everything that they would like to in terms of delivering the social contract with the people of Scotland as it's described, is it realistic to expect that that social contract can be as universal in terms of the number of payments that you would like, given what the Scottish Fiscal Commission is reporting here?
Well, it is important that we look at the financial sustainability of social security in the well, short, medium and long term, because it's not actually that far away in terms of fiscal planning. I go back to the point again about the fact that the increases in spend are in effect due largely to decisions that have either been taken proactively by the Scottish Government. So, for example, on the Scottish Child Payment, which from memory is just under £500 million we currently spend on that. But the biggest change that the Fiscal Commission forecasts are showing are due to the forecasting of decreases in the Scottish Government block grant because of changes that are being made by the UK Government. So that is a substantial impact that will be had. Clearly, I am still. I was going to say you were hopeful. I'm not hopeful. Clearly, I would hope there is a change of heart when the UK Government looks at the evidence of its own impact assessments, that they will reflect on that and change their position, which would markedly change the forecasting that the Fiscal Commission has developed. Clearly, any changes that the UK Government will make to winter full payment in the future will also assist, although we do not know when any changes will be made and we don't know what those changes will be. So again, those can't be included in the Fiscal Commission's forecast, which have to just go on what the UK government policy is at this point. But I do accept the fact that there is a challenge there. It is a decision that government will need to make every year about how it balances its budget. But I go back to the point that any change to the level of spend in social security, in essence, people asking us to reduce that are asking us to reduce eligibility or asking us to reduce the adequacy of benefits. I mean, those are the only two ways where that benefit expenditure comes down, and that is not something that the government wants to take forward. I appreciate that therefore means that there will be difficult decisions that we will have to take elsewhere in the budget, but I am exceptionally uncomfortable about saying that the way to tackle this is to take money away from disabled people, carers and low-income families.
I completely understand some of that, Cabinet Secretary. And we can debate the politics of this, and I think that's obviously for the Chamber in different areas. We have got to accept, though, factually, that the current circumstances just now, and based on the statistics that the SFC just come out with today, there is a big black hole, let's be honest, in the amount of money that the Scottish Government is predicted to take in set against the projected spend. And what I am asking you is whether you feel that in order to get some extra revenue in, is it just a case from the Scottish Government's perspective that they're going to pursue higher and higher tax rates progressively, as is the comment from the Scottish Government, or is it open to looking at greater targeting of the policies that we've just been talking about so that we're not spending quite so much in some areas in order to try to reduce that? Is that the sort of economic crux of the matter? Because yesterday at the Economy Committee, I heard David Phillips talking about the issue about behavioural changes because of tax change.
So the government has laid out reassurances that we will not be making further changes to tax rates in this parliamentary session. We've been very clear on that to provide clarity and reassurance to people. I would caution against the kind of phrase black hole. There is a gap between what is forecasted that the Scottish Government will get and what the Scottish Government will pay out on social security. There is a gap that will be filled.
Is that not a black hole, Cabinet Secretary?
No, that's a gap that will be filled by the Scottish Government budget in its totality. We recognise the fact that that money will need to be found. But I point to the fact that we have chosen to invest in social security. I make no apologies for that. But what we've chosen to invest in social security in Scotland, above the funding we receive from the UK Government, is projected to be less than 3.5% of the total Scottish Government resource budget by 2029-30. So I don't underestimate the challenge, but it is something which will be looked at to ensure that the budgets are balanced as it needs to be. So there is a gap in what we get from the UK compared to what we spend, but we will fill that gap by using the money that we have in the Scottish Government budget. Does that make it more challenging in areas? Yes. Will people suggest that we should take money away from different pots and different policies? Yes. But what the government's made clear about is that we will not do that by taking away services or support from people who already receive that.
Right. So put that into the context of the next child poverty plan, the strategy behind that. Are you saying that in order to try to address some of the shortfalls, that the government's intention is to try to ensure that the additional money is raised through progressive taxation rather than at targeting the policies that are working best and removing some of the policies that are obviously not delivering in the same way that we would like?
Well, if there are policies that, for example, aren't delivering, then that would be shown in the evaluation, and we would look to ensure that those services or policies are redesigned so they do deliver. So we mentioned the early learning and childcare. If does that deliver? Is the model that we're proposing the best way to deliver that? And what are we learning from those early adopter sites? So there is clearly an evaluation that goes through for policies to see if we're getting from them what we expected, and also is that being delivered in a cost-effective manner. The other areas that I think are exceptionally important in this, where it's not, and I know Liz Smith knows this, it's not a black or white issue about taking away a service or putting up taxes. We need to look at public service reform, which obviously falls under the work that Ivan McKay is doing to deliver services in a better way. I go back to the data sharing issue, the whole family support. There are services that are available to families that the way that it has been delivered over time makes it exceptionally challenging for those families to get the support that they need. And can that be done in different ways that actually provide a better, more cost-effective service? So there are other ways that we clearly are looking at as a government to ensure that the policies we're delivering, the services that we're delivering, and indeed services that other people are delivering, either on our behalf or through their own powers, are effective and cost-effective at the same time. So I would put that important third challenge in that government is undertaking under Ivan McKay.
Yeah, no, I accept that, and I think it's very difficult when you can't take things away easily. I absolutely understand that. But I think there are examples of policy areas, two of which we've discussed this morning, where the policy of universalism, I would suggest, isn't as effective, both in terms of the delivery and the cost basis, as we might wish. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. And obviously, Cabinet Secretary, you've touched upon investment, but in terms of the scale of action as well. So can I ask what work the Scottish Government is doing on potential scale, in pace of action as well, and what sort of measures the Social Security are taking in terms of focusing on child poverty as well, so and how you meet those targets for 2030, if you could just expand on that.
So there is a great deal of work that's obviously been undertaken to ensure that the benefits that are available to people are being taken up. That's one of the key areas that we do need to look at in terms of the impact the policy can have. And that's why the benefit take-up strategy is an important part of social security. Again, I hope it's one of those areas that the UK Government will also look at in their task force, because at this moment in the Scottish Government is the only area that is looking at benefit take-up encouragement in the round. Although I appreciate the UK Government has done some more work, certainly, than previous governments on certain benefits. We're also clearly looking at more work that we can do to assist particularly larger families through the effectively scrapping the two-child cap impact. So that is the next significant piece of work that is currently being undertaken. And the fact that that will help, I think the Fiscal Commission estimate that it will be paid to 42,000 children in Scotland. And that's an important area where we estimate, Scottish Government modelling estimates that the two-child limit will result in 20,000 fewer children living in poverty in 26-27. And we know that the depth of poverty will be reduced for thousands more. So that's the next area where the government will be taking action that will assist in the social security field.
Okay, thank you. I believe Paul O'Kane would like to come in.
Thanks, Convener. Just on the point about the Scottish Government's policy in terms of two-child limit, the kind of background work that's been done on that. So we have a lot of conversation this morning about the need to take decisions over a period of time. Obviously, the two-child limit was brought in 2017. The government had a policy where it wasn't going to mitigate because it said it couldn't. It then introduced this policy, obviously, that we're discussing this morning. And the Cabinet Secretary, I think, just gave figures there of the modelling that's been done as to what impact that will have in terms of Scotland. I've obviously asked a number of times when the decision was made by the government. So I asked at committee when we originally discussed the proposal. I know that the Finance Secretary was asked at Finance Committee when that decision was made. I've had to ask parliamentary questions and I've used FOI and I can't get an answer as to exactly when the decision was made because I think it's important in the context of understanding what work was being done prior to that to look at the issue. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can just put on the record today when she took the decision and if she's not willing to do that, if she can just say why she's not willing to do that.
Well, I'm conscious of the number of FOIs, parliamentary questions and that you've answered on this, Mr O'Kane. I think this has been dealt with, but if I can summarise the Scottish Government's position is we took action when we gave up on the Labour UK Government taking that action and we delivered that through the budget.
So you're not going to say when you took the decision?
I think we've answered that in all the FOIs, parliamentary questions.
You haven't, with respect, because you haven't given me the date that you took the decision. I'm just interested in terms of what work was done prior to, given the government spent a long time saying that it couldn't take action. So if you can give me a date, that would be really helpful.
We said that it was the responsibility of the UK Government to take action. When we had a change in UK Government and that action wasn't taken, then we felt we had no alternative but to step forward where the UK Government has consistently failed on that issue. And I think, for the sake of brevities, and I don't have all the FOIs and PQs in front of me, so I'm not going to read them out, but I would refer you to all the PQs and FOIs you have, which I believe have answered your question.
Okay.
So, just in terms of the work, the good work that's actually going on at a local level, I know even from my own constituency, East Kilbride, I visited a nursery there in terms of affordable childcare, and they're a registered charity. And what they've done is they've actually employed what is a support officer. So if they are seeing, or have concerns over families in terms of affording childcare and whatnot for breakfast club and like after school, they will then subsidise it somewhat in comparison. And I know the costs change per local authority as well. Some of the local authorities subsidise more than others, but this was a really good aspect of working closely with families. But also what they were doing was they were advising the families about benefits that they could apply for, such as the Scottish Child Payment, which many folk didn't realise was available to them. So that's helped hugely as well in terms of childcare. Can I just ask you, Cabinet Secretary, how this can be identified, and as an example as that, and I'm sure there's many more, and how it can be scaled up as well, and to create a consistent approach across all local authorities?
Well, I think it is a very important area that you've mentioned there, Convener, about the work that can be undertaken, whether it's in a school setting or other settings where there's already relationships between parents, carers and a service, and our requirement to ensure that the services that we have are available where people need it and when they need it. If I can point to the work which I've mentioned briefly before around the Fairer Futures Partnership work, and I went on an excellent visit to North Ayrshire recently, where we had that same type of discussion within a school setting about what can be provided, again, by a kind of trusted person who the parents already have a relationship with, where they can then maybe go and seek support on income maximisation benefits, or indeed wider support as well, discussions around employability that we had in that school too, where that parent was then supported through a number of different ways, and that all done in a trusted setting with trusted relationships that allowed that parent then, for some of the parents that I met that day, to move on to employment or to move on to education and training on the route to employment, on the path to employment. And I think those are the types of areas which you touch on there, Convener, and which is very much part of the Fairer Futures Partnership that is now being expanded. Because that type of work and that type of support is a very important way of providing an alternative route out of poverty through employment, and doing that in a supportive fashion without sanction.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm now going to invite Gordon MacDonald in. Thanks.
We've already touched upon the UK Child Poverty Strategy this morning, and the UK Government has indicated that they want to build on the positive work already underway by the Scottish Government to tackle child poverty. So, given the delay in the UK Government's Child Poverty Strategy, what would you like to see in that strategy that would be helpful in the fight against child poverty?
Well, there's a number of areas where the UK Government can and should be taking further action. We've mentioned a number of those, particularly in relation to social security today. That would, not just the two-child cap, but if they were to scrap the bedroom tax, the benefit cap, the 5-week wait for universal credit and so on, that would make a big difference to families. But for the aspects such as the benefit cap from next financial year, the two-child cap and the bedroom tax that we're already mitigating on, that would make an enormous difference to the amount of money that the Scottish Government has to be able to work further on child poverty measures. So those are the types of areas where they can and should be doing more. There's clearly a number of other areas which we're very keen that they work on. I've mentioned already the social tariff in the energy sector. There's a great deal of work that only they can undertake when it comes to energy costs. So if we're looking at the impacts that are hitting families the hardest, it is often energy costs and it is often the inadequacies of benefits, and those two are obviously reserved to the UK. Would point to the other aspects that I've mentioned before around the areas within the recent Green Paper, and indeed other areas that they're going on to not even consult on, around changes to disability benefits. So those are the areas where I really hope they will tackle some of the issues. We clearly have set a number of asks out to the task force. I'd be happy to provide further information to the committee in writing about the specifics, because what we've also gone through is employability, how changes to child tax credits would help with childcare. So there's a number of areas where we have provided a lot of detail in the types of works that could be undertaken at a reserved area that will positively impact on child poverty, and, if done correctly, can work very effectively alongside the work that's already been undertaken in the Scottish Government. So there is still a real opportunity for both governments to work together on that. Now, we're clearly unsighted on where that task force report is going, and I accept that UK Government ministers need that private space to have their own policy formation. That is entirely understandable and unusual within governments, but there are areas, particularly as we move closer to publication, where we're going to have a better understanding of the implications of some of the UK Government changes, because what we don't want to get into is some of the examples that we've seen over the last year or so, where changes are made and we're then playing catch-up about what the implications are to Scottish Government budgets or services.
Yeah. So it would be really helpful if you could provide us with further information when you get the opportunity.
Yep.
The other point I was wanting to ask you about the Child Poverty Strategy was in relation to targets. So, excuse me, the latest figures say there's 4.5 million children across the UK in relative poverty. That's an increase of 100,000 in the last year and an increase of 750,000 since 2010 across the whole of the UK. The UK Government in 2016 scrapped the legally binding targets on child poverty levels. What's your view about whether they should be reintroduced into the strategy?
Well, I hope they are reintroduced into the strategy. We are, again, as well as calling on the UK Government to make changes over reserved areas, we are endeavouring to assist UK Government colleagues with our learning, our experiences in the policies that we've had. I know the Welsh Government is doing likewise in terms of the areas that they've been undertaking, so that we can learn from each other, and that's, I think, an important part of that. So as well as the calls, we are trying to assist with learning. Part of that has been our experiences around targets, the importance of targets. Yes, the challenges in reaching those targets. So we are sharing that information about those as well. I don't know if officials want to say a little bit more on the types of work we're doing on that.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that's really important that we've touched upon is the importance of evaluation, whether that's quantitative, qualitative, and I think one of the key things that we've been doing at official level is to share that freely with our colleagues in the UK Government, Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Executive, and indeed the Irish Government, because there's a huge amount of information out there in terms of what makes the difference. The other thing that I think is really important to think about is the connectivity between devolved and reserved competence and the impact that can have on individual families. And that's why for the 6 priority family types in Scotland, we have just introduced some new guidance in government to support colleagues to better understand the impact in terms of how they make policy and how they deliver it on those 6 priority family types, because they account for around 89% of the children in poverty in Scotland. So we've shared that freely with the UK Government colleagues to help their understanding and build their evidence base. And I think at official level it's incredibly important that we continue to do that. And that's why evaluation is built in so clearly to our Fairer Future Partnership work, the early adopters work, and a huge amount of the kind of policies in place, because it's the cumulative impact and the interaction between those policies for individual families that makes the massive difference that's required.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite Paul O'Kane. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Convener. And just on the issues around the UK poverty strategy, and I think it's encouraging to hear that the Cabinet Secretary continues to seek that engagement, which is important. I noted our previous comments about the delay to the publication of the strategy. I mean, she would recognise that governments often have to take more time in order to understand the work that they're doing. So I note, for example, the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy is delayed again, and the Finance Committee has had a number of things to say about that, and obviously has an impact on what we're discussing this morning. Obviously, the scope of that UK task force is very important, and we've talked about the two-child limit, for example, this morning, and she knows my view on that, and my view that the UK Government should absolutely act on that. Of course, all of the measures within any task force have got to be paid for, and I think that's part of the issue around needing more time. And I'm just keen to understand, because the UK Government have made budgetary decisions, all of which have been opposed by the government in Scotland and the Cabinet Secretary around taxation. So all of the revenue-raising measures in the budget have been opposed. So I'm just keen to understand what is her view about how we might pay for some of the interventions if she is not in favour of the tax-raising measures that were taken in the UK budget.
On the aspects around why there's been a change to the work that Ms Robertson will be taking forward, that's because we have to wait or we don't have to wait, but I think it would be premature to deliver a review of Scottish finances before the spending review from the UK Government on the 11th of June. So all Mr Kane has done is highlight once again how utterly dependent we are on... Well, we can have it.
You would respectfully acknowledge there hasn't been a medium-term financial strategy for quite some time from the Scottish Government.
Well, indeed, and part of the challenge for that is the annual budgetary settings by UK government that makes medium-term financial strategy exceptionally difficult when we are reliant on the vast majority of our funding from UK government. But regardless of the challenges that that's presenting, that's exactly what the Cabinet Secretary Finance will endeavour to do. And yes, there are challenges within government. Decisions do need to be taken on how we can deliver the services. What I think the Scottish Government fundamentally objects to is the decisions of the UK Government to make spending decisions that actually balance the books on the backs of the most vulnerable in our society, whether that's disabled people or pensioners or indeed the continuation of the two-child cap. So, yes, we all have decisions to make in government. I just wouldn't choose to take money away from disabled people, pensioners, or continue to take it away from large families.
So the Cabinet Secretary made that point to me many times, and that's her view. I'm just keen to understand, though, in terms of the revenue-raising measures that the UK Government can take. She doesn't support any of the ones that were taken, whether that be national insurance, whether it was the changes to inheritance tax, whether it was the levy on energy companies. So I'm just keen to understand, does she have any suggestions in terms of how the UK Government should raise revenue?
Well, I think it's been widely recognised that the increases in national insurances have been a tax on jobs. So how a UK government can expect to deliver growth while actually delivering a tax on jobs remains a puzzle to me, both at an economic and a political level. The aspects around the UK government is it has a lot more levers within its control to be able to change and affect taxation and services. There are a number of changes that UK government could have made, both on taxation and services. And I simply say once again, I wouldn't have chose to do it on the backs of disabled people.
Conscious of time. So that concludes our questions for today. So can I just say thank you to the Cabinet Secretary and the officials as well for coming along. So we'll have a brief suspension to allow for a change in the Scottish Government officials. Thank you. Of the following Scottish statutory instrument: the Social Security Miscellaneous Amendment, Scotland Regulations 2025. This instrument is subject to the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before it comes into force. So I welcome back the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, and I also welcome the Scottish Government officials, Ruth Steele, Unit Head Social Security Futures, and Kirsten Simony Lefevre, Solicitor, Legal Department, Scottish Government. So thank you very much for joining us today. So following this evidence session, the committee will be invited in the upcoming agenda item to consider a motion to approve the instrument. And I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. So I'm now going to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and I appreciate the opportunity to give evidence on the Social Security Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025, which bring forward a number of minor but necessary updates to legislation. The amendments make three separate sets of changes to the legislation. The first set of provisions are required to remove references to tax credits from certain devolved benefit legislation. This follows the UK Government's decision to close tax credits from 5th April this year and ensures that the policy intent of the legislation matches the reality of which qualifying reserve benefits are available to determine eligibility for devolved benefits. Tax credits formed a route for establishing eligibility and child responsibility in relation to Best Start Foods, Best Start grants and the Scottish Child Payment. They also formed a route for eligibility to funeral support payment, the winter heating payment and the pension age winter heating payment. Tax credits closed for new applications in April 2019 and the DWP and HMRC undertook a planned transition known as Move to UC to move eligible tax credit recipients onto universal credit before tax credits closed in April. The amendments have been reviewed by the Scottish Commission on Social Security, who asked about the Scottish Government's role in the promotion of universal credit. Scottish Government officials have worked closely with Social Security Scotland to deliver a synchronised letter campaign which identified those in receipt of devolved social security payments with tax credits as their qualifying benefit. Social Security Scotland wrote letters and made phone calls to these clients, informing them of the upcoming changes and the effect it could have on the eligibility for their devolved benefits. There is no evidence that the move to UC has affected the numbers or eligibility of those applying for the named benefits, with both applications and awards remaining relatively stable for each Scottish Government benefit. A further amendment is required to the Social Security Information Sharing Scotland Regulations 2021 to replace an outdated reference to discretionary housing payments being made under the Discretionary Financial Assistance Regulations 2001. The final set of amendments are required to ensure that appeals are dealt with consistently across all benefits. These amendments update the Scottish Child Payment Regulations 2020, the Carers Allowance Supplement and Young Carers Grants, Resident Requirements and Procedural Provisions EU Exit Scotland Regulations 2020. The changes relate to appeals for Scottish Child Payment and Carers Allowance Supplement, where individuals are seeking to receive this support from outside of the UK. These amendments align with the Social Security Scotland Act 2018 as amended by the Social Security Amendment Scotland Act 2025. I'd like to also extend my thanks to SCOS for their formal scrutiny of the draft amendments, and I also welcome the opportunity to assist the committee in the consideration of the regulations today.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I did have several questions, but you've basically answered one of them anyway. But I also wanted just to point out that if you're welcome to invite your officials in to answer anything if you wish to do so. So can I just ask you to outline the advantages and disadvantages of using reserve benefits as the main qualifying condition for devolved benefits?
So Targeting support to those that are in receipt of certain benefits is an alternative to means testing, so that allows qualifying benefits to assist in essence in a means testing manner. But it also helps check other criteria such as residency and identity, which then reduces the evidence requirements that the agency has to make itself. Clearly, if we weren't doing that, for example, and if we had our own means testing, that would require more onerous information to be required from the clients and a more onerous administrative system as well. So those are the benefits from having the attachment to reserved benefits as a qualifying condition.
If any other members have any questions? Okay, in that case, we'll move on to the next agenda item. So agenda item 4 is the formal consideration of motion S6M 17467 that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee recommends that the Social Security Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025 draft be approved. And I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary wants to come in to speak, or if you can move the motion. Thank you.
Move the motion.
Okay. I now invite contributions from any members. Okay. Okay. I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to sum up. If you... No.
Nothing to add.
Thank you. So the question is that motion S6M 17467 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville be approved. Are we all agreed? Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So that concludes our public business for today, and we will now move into private.